What if I told you that the most influential economics book of the 21st century proves that everything you've been taught about wealth and inequality is wrong? Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century didn't just shake the academic world. When it was published in 2013, it completely revolutionized how we understand money power and the future of capitalism itself. This isn't your typical dry economics textbook filled with incomprehensible jargon. Instead, Piketty presents 3 centuries of meticulously researched data that reveals a shocking truth about how wealth actually flows in our society. The French economist spent 15 years collecting tax records, inheritance documents, and financial data from 20 countries to uncover patterns that will fundamentally change how you view your own financial future. His findings challenge the very foundations of modern economic theory and expose why the gap between rich and poor keeps widening despite technological progress and economic growth. This book doesn't just explain what's happening to global wealth distribution. It predicts what's coming next and why it matters for every single person watching this video. Capital in the 21st Century represents a monumental achievement in economic research that combines rigorous statistical analysis with accessible storytelling. Thomas Piketty, a professor at the Paris School of Economics, created the most comprehensive database of wealth and income inequality ever assembled, spanning 3 centuries and covering the world's major economies. Unlike previous economic studies that relied on limited datasets or theoretical models, Piketty's work is built on actual historical records, including tax returns, estate records, and national account data from countries including the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Japan. The book's central thesis revolves around a simple but profound mathematical relationship that Piketty expresses as R greater than G, where R represents the return on capital and G represents economic growth. This formula explains why wealth inequality tends to increase over time in capitalist economies. When the rate of return on capital consistently exceeds the rate of economic growth, those who own capital accumulate wealth faster than those who depend on labour income. What makes this book revolutionary is not just its scope, but its timing. Published in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, when questions about inequality were becoming increasingly urgent, Piketty provided the historical context and empirical evidence that policymakers and citizens desperately needed. The book became an unlikely bestseller, selling over 2.5 million copies worldwide and sparking debates in academic circles, political arenas, and popular media. Piketty's approach combines the analytical rigour of modern economics with the broad historical perspective of classical economists like Adam Smith and Karl Marx. He demonstrates that the relatively equal income distribution experienced in developed countries during the mid-20th century was actually an historical anomaly caused by the disruptions of 2 world wars and the Great Depression, not a natural tendency of capitalist systems. The book's narrative unfolds through a careful examination of wealth concentration patterns across different time periods and geographical regions. Piketty begins by establishing that the 19th century was characterized by extreme wealth inequality, where a small elite controlled vast fortunes, while the majority of the population lived in relative poverty. This pattern was disrupted by the catastrophic events of the early to mid-20th century, including 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the rise of progressive taxation systems. These disruptions destroyed much of the accumulated capital of the wealthy elite and created opportunities for broader wealth distribution. The post-war boom period from 1945 to 1975 saw unprecedented economic growth and relatively low inequality levels in developed countries. However, Piketty argues that this period was exceptional rather than representative of capitalism's natural tendencies. Since the 1980s, wealth inequality has been steadily increasing across developed nations, returning toward the extreme levels seen in the 19th century. This trend coincides with policies that reduced progressive taxation, deregulated financial markets, and prioritised economic growth over redistribution. Piketty's data shows that without intervention, this trajectory will continue, potentially creating levels of inequality that threaten democratic institutions and social stability. The book examines different types of capital, including real estate, financial assets, and business ownership, showing how each contributes to overall wealth concentration. Piketty also explores the role of inheritance in perpetuating inequality across generations, demonstrating how family wealth can compound over decades and centuries when returns on capital exceed economic growth rates. Perhaps most significantly, the book projects current trends into the future, suggesting that without policy changes, the 21st century could see inequality levels that surpass even those of the 19th century. This projection is based on demographic changes, slower economic growth in developed countries, and the continued advantage of capital returns over wage growth. The first major point Piketty establishes is the historical pattern of wealth concentration in Europe and America during the 19th century. His research reveals that in countries like France and Britain, the wealthiest 10% of the population controlled between 80 and 90% of all wealth. This extreme concentration was maintained through inheritance systems that allowed fortunes to compound across generations. The wealthy elite lived primarily off returns from their capital rather than earned income, creating a rentier class that dominated society both economically and politically. The second crucial development was the Great Disruption of the early 20th century, which Piketty calls the period of destruction of capital. The combination of World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and their aftermaths fundamentally altered the wealth landscape. Physical destruction of property, inflation, high taxation to fund war efforts, and economic instability destroyed much of the accumulated capital of the wealthy. This destruction was not random, but systematically affected those with the most to lose, creating opportunities for more equitable wealth distribution. The third major event was the emergence of what Piketty terms the Golden Age of Capitalism, from 1945 to 1975. During this period, developed countries experienced unprecedented economic growth rates, often exceeding 5% annually. This growth was accompanied by relatively low inequality levels and the rise of a substantial middle class. Progressive taxation systems, strong labour unions, and social welfare programmes helped ensure that the benefits of economic growth were more broadly shared across society. The fourth significant development was the ideological shift beginning in the 1980s toward policies that prioritised economic efficiency over equality. This period saw the implementation of supply-side economics, deregulation of financial markets, and reduction of progressive taxation. While these policies were intended to stimulate economic growth, Piketty's data shows they primarily benefited capital owners at the expense of wage earners, marking the beginning of the return to higher inequality levels. The fifth major trend involves the changing nature of top incomes in the modern era. Unlike the 19th century, when the wealthy derived most of their income from inherited capital, today's top earners increasingly receive enormous salaries and bonuses, particularly in the financial sector and among corporate executives. This development has created a new class of supermanagers whose compensation often exceeds what could be justified by their contribution to productivity. The sixth critical observation concerns the role of education and skills in the modern economy. While conventional wisdom suggests that technological progress and education will reduce inequality by increasing the value of skilled labour, Piketty's evidence indicates that this effect is limited. The returns to education, while positive, are insufficient to counteract the advantages enjoyed by capital owners, especially as the skill premium has stabilised in recent decades. The seventh major point addresses the global dimension of inequality. Piketty extends his analysis beyond individual countries to examine how globalisation has affected wealth distribution worldwide. While global inequality between countries has decreased as emerging economies have grown rapidly, inequality within countries has generally increased. This pattern suggests that globalisation has created winners and losers within each society based on their position in the global economy. The eighth and perhaps most alarming development is Piketty's projection for the future of inequality. Based on demographic trends showing slower population growth and lower productivity gains in developed countries, combined with the mathematical relationship between capital returns and economic growth, he predicts a return to extreme inequality levels unless significant policy interventions occur. This projection challenges the assumption that economic development naturally leads to more equitable outcomes. The first essential takeaway is understanding that inequality is not a natural law, but a political choice. Piketty's historical analysis demonstrates that the level of inequality in any society is largely determined by the institutions and policies that govern it. The relatively equal societies of the mid-20th century were created through deliberate policy decisions, including progressive taxation, strong labour protections, and social welfare systems. This means that current inequality trends can be altered through appropriate policy interventions. The second crucial insight involves recognizing the power of compound returns on capital. When wealthy individuals can consistently earn returns of 4 to 5% annually on their investments while the overall economy grows at only 2 to 3%, their wealth grows faster than the general standard of living. Over decades and centuries, this seemingly small difference creates enormous disparities in wealth accumulation that become self-reinforcing. The third important lesson concerns the limitations of education as a solution to inequality. While investing in education and skills development is valuable for individual advancement and overall productivity, it cannot single-handedly solve the inequality problem. The returns to education, while positive, are bounded by the skills premium, whereas returns to capital can potentially compound indefinitely. This means that educational policies must be combined with other interventions to address inequality effectively. The fourth critical takeaway relates to the importance of progressive taxation in maintaining social cohesion. Piketty's research shows that progressive tax systems are not just tools for raising revenue, but essential mechanisms for preventing excessive wealth concentration. Without progressive taxation on income, wealth, and inheritance, democratic societies risk evolving into plutocracies where economic power translates directly into political influence. The fifth significant insight involves understanding the role of inheritance in perpetuating inequality across generations. In societies where capital returns exceed growth rates, inherited wealth becomes increasingly important relative to earned income. This creates a situation where family background becomes more important than individual effort in determining lifetime outcomes, undermining the meritocratic ideals that many societies claim to value. The sixth key lesson addresses the global nature of the inequality challenge. In an interconnected world economy, addressing inequality requires international cooperation and coordination. Tax havens and regulatory arbitrage allow wealthy individuals and corporations to avoid the progressive taxation systems that individual countries implement, undermining domestic efforts to reduce inequality. The seventh important takeaway concerns the relationship between inequality and economic growth. Contrary to arguments that inequality is necessary for economic dynamism, Piketty's evidence suggests that extreme inequality can actually harm long-term growth by reducing aggregate demand and social mobility. Societies with more equitable wealth distribution often achieve better educational outcomes and more sustainable growth patterns. The eighth crucial insight involves recognizing the political consequences of extreme inequality. When wealth becomes highly concentrated, it inevitably translates into concentrated political power, threatening democratic institutions and processes. History shows that extreme inequality can lead to social instability, populist movements, and even violent conflict when legitimate channels for addressing grievances become ineffective. The ninth essential takeaway emphasizes the importance of transparency and data in addressing inequality. Much of the current inequality crisis stems from a lack of reliable information about wealth concentration. Piketty's work demonstrates the value of systematic data collection and analysis in understanding economic trends and evaluating policy effectiveness. The 10th and final key insight involves the urgency of addressing inequality trends before they become entrenched. Historical experience shows that once extreme inequality becomes established, it can persist for generations or even centuries. The relatively equal societies of the mid-20th century required extraordinary disruptions to create, suggesting that preventive action is more effective than corrective measures after inequality has reached extreme levels. Capital in the 21st century stands as one of the most important economic works of our time, fundamentally changing how we understand wealth, power, and social justice in modern societies. Piketty's meticulous research methodology and comprehensive historical analysis provide an empirical foundation for debates about inequality that were previously dominated by ideological arguments and anecdotal evidence. The book's central insight, that a greater than G creates a natural tendency toward wealth concentration, offers a simple but powerful framework for understanding complex economic phenomena. The implications of Piketty's work extend far beyond academic economics into the realms of politics, social policy, and moral philosophy. His demonstration that the relatively equal societies of the mid-20th century were historical anomalies challenges complacent assumptions about economic progress and social development. The book's projection that inequality could return to 19th century levels serves as a wake-up call for policymakers and citizens who value democratic institutions and social mobility. Perhaps most importantly, Piketty's work provides hope by showing that inequality is not an inevitable consequence of economic development, but a result of policy choices that can be changed. His proposals for progressive taxation, international cooperation, and greater transparency offer practical pathways for addressing the inequality crisis. While implementing these solutions will require significant political will and social coordination, the historical evidence suggests that such transformations are possible when societies recognise the stakes involved and commit to collective action. This book will likely influence economic thought and policy debates for decades to come, serving as both a diagnostic tool for understanding current challenges and a roadmap for creating more equitable societies in the 21st century.